Hello everyone, this is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to this tutorial for my 12 Days of Christmas wool felt ornaments. And I will start out by saying that these ornaments, they are not difficult at all. They are quite simple actually, and in fact, in the instructions, I really could have just said, cut out the patterns, put the color on them, glue them together, do the beading and the stitching, and you're done. But that is just not how I work. If you have ever purchased any of my hand embroidery patterns or any of my other ornament patterns, you know that is just not the kind, those are just not the kind of instructions that I like to give to my customers. I like to make sure that you have all the information you need so that you have an easy time of making them and a very enjoyable time. And so that's why I'm making this video for you. Since I mentioned instructions, please know that whether you purchased the PDF pattern with the digital instructions for these designs, or you got a supply kit that has a printed brochure in it, those both have complete instructions in them with photos and step-by-step written out instructions, diagrams, and I'm going to talk about all the techniques that I'm going to be covering in this video. So use those instructions in conjunction with this video and you'll have everything you need to know. So without any further delay, let's get right to the first step, which is cutting out the felt patterns. Well, I kind of lied to you, and I'm sorry to pull a bait and switch, but the first step is not actually to cut out the patterns. The first step is something that is perhaps not 100% required, but it's a good idea in some situations. And that step is to pre-shrink your felt. That is because we're going to be getting this wet. It's wool felt. We're going to be getting it wet, and it does shrink just a little bit. In general, for all of the components of the pieces that you'll put on the on the interior, like the smaller pieces, you probably don't have to do this. And so the ones that the pieces of felt that I would recommend that you do this on are the ones that are these large pieces, like this pink piece or this blue piece, the ones that I call the background shapes. And you can see here, I did not pre-shrink either of these pieces of felt. But if you look, you can see the difference in the edging here. This pink felt shrunk quite a bit. I mean, a good bit. It's supposed to only have about 1/8 of an inch along here, and see how much it shrank. I think what I'll probably, it's not the end of the world. It is only sort of a problem because you're trying to fit elements on top of these background pieces, and if they shrink a little bit, you have less room. Again, not a serious problem. I'll probably just trim this off, but that would have been avoided. I could have avoided that if I had pre-shrunk my felt. So my overall recommendation is perhaps do it only on the colors of felt that will have these large background pieces, perhaps. To pre-shrink the felt is very simple. Give yourself some time because it'll take some time to dry. But just before you cut any of your patterns, when you still just have your larger piece of felt, just take it, put it on in a dish or something. You can just get it wet. It doesn't have to be hot water. Just get it wet, and you can soak it in a shallow dish of water if you want. You can also just spray it really well, the front and the back, with just like a spray of water. Just get it pretty wet. And don't squeeze it, don't crinkle it, obviously don't wring it. I perhaps wouldn't even press on it with a towel because that can leave indentations. Really just get it wet. And if you want to move it to a paper towel or something, and just let it dry flat. And as it dries, it will shrink a little bit. That's really all you have to do. It's like I said, it's not the most fun step. The other stuff is way more fun, but it's probably a good idea for the large pieces. Wool felt is simply a joy to work with, and it has so many lovely qualities. One of the drawbacks, however, of wool felt, or just any felt really, but wool felt, is that it's hard, you can't trace through it, and it's hard to trace onto it. You can do it, It just the fibers catch on pens and things. And so I was trying to find a way to cut out patterns very accurately, very detailed patterns. That's the other thing. It's hard to trace a very, detailed, intricate design. And I came up with this method several years ago, and I have used it hundreds of times, and it works great. I love it. There are a few things to know about how to do this though. So what we are doing is we are printing the designs. Either if you bought the PDF pattern, you're going to print them yourself onto sticky label paper or like sticker paper. And if you have purchased a supply kit, they will come already pre-printed with everything labeled and everything. So either way, once you get, well, let me show you. Here's one that's been printed, and then I have cut this piece out. When you cut it out so that you leave a little bit of paper around the outside edge. You don't want to cut yet right on the pattern line, okay? And the next step could just be that you take this design and peel off the back, stick it on your felt, and cut it out. That would work, except that this paper is very sticky. The adhesive on the back is very, very sticky. It works, but when you peel it off, it will leave your felt very fuzzy. The edges will be very fuzzy, but even worse, if you have very narrow, small areas or thin areas in your pattern, when you tear it off, it could easily pull the felt apart. Since felt is not a woven fabric, it's a felted fabric, right? So what we need to do first, before we just take the backing off and stick it on, is to make the sticky back less sticky. And there are two methods that I have used to do this. One of them is to, let me get a pattern piece and I'll pull the backing off. Speaking of peeling off the back, honestly, this might be the most difficult part of the entire process, is getting this sticky back, to peel it away. And usually I will kind of fold this over and curl it, and I can generally kind of get my, a fingernail between there. But here is a tip. I use a needle, and even if I've gotten just a little bit going, but sometimes even when I haven't, let me see if you can see this, get up close. If you put the tip of your needle right in between there, it's much easier to get it going. All right, easier than your fingernail. So once you get that going, get that started, peel off the back, and now you have the very sticky pattern. And what I have been doing, I've done this for a long, long time, I use this method for a long time, is to get a scrap piece of, this is wool felt, and to repeatedly stick it onto this felt. I have used my clothing, jeans, whatever. I used that for a long time at first, but then this is really just, it's kind of a little hard on your clothes. So you can do this repeatedly over and over and over. You can do it a lot. You can even drag it across. You're just trying to pick up those fibers and get them stuck to the back of this, onto this adhesive. Keep doing it until you've gotten as many fibers on there as you think you can, and now you can stick it on your felt and cut it out. Now, this technique does work, but it can often leave this still just a little bit sticky. So here's another method. I have this piece, I've taken off the sticky back, and now I am going to use cornstarch. I know it sounds crazy, but it works really, really well. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a little pinch of it. I've put a paper towel down, so don't do this around your area where you've got all your other artwork. Maybe do this in the kitchen or someplace, but just get a little pinch of this cornstarch and just sprinkle it on the back, and then just start to carefully, just sort of generally rub it around. And it's going to feel like, where the cornstarch is, like you've completely taken away all of the stickiness. And you don't want to completely remove it. You obviously want it to stick to your felt, right? But just, even just the residue of the cornstarch on your fingers, you can just sort of keep rubbing it. You can tell if you have gotten it, obviously you can feel it. You can also tell if you have covered the back with cornstarch. I don't know if I can get Let me see if I can get this to show. If you sort of hold it up to the light, it will be dull. Where it's still sticky, it'll be shiny. And where you've got cornstarch on it, you probably can't even see because it's already dull. But, you know, I've kind of left a little bit of more stickiness on the edges. See that? And in the center here, it's really doesn't feel very sticky. I used very, very little cornstarch on that. You can use flour, like cooking flour, but it's much grainier. And I prefer cornstarch because it's very, very silky and doesn't take much at all. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to put this pattern piece onto my felt. And I'm going to push it down because I did take away a lot of that stickiness. And let me say here, when you cut out your patterns, they all have the color name of the pattern on it. So before you start sticking them down, and particularly before you start cutting them out, make sure you have enough room on each color of felt for all the pieces that need to go on that color. So, you know, don't just randomly stick a piece in the middle of a big piece of felt and cut it out and then realize you're going to need that area of felt later for a larger piece. So anyway, just make sure you have enough room. So even though it seemed like I had completely taken away all of that stickiness, you can tell this is sticking. It's not, you know, going to stay on there forever, but, you know, I can also just like rub it with my fingers or my fingernail just to make sure it will stick. I'm also going to hold a little bit while I cut. But now, speaking of cutting, these are the scissors I recommend. I love these scissors. I carry them in my shop. They are 5-inch micro tip scissors, and that micro tip really makes a difference. They're very, very sharp, first of all, and so you can get very accurate lines. And so let me show you. Let me just do it for you here. So I'm going to start cutting, and like any good cutting, you want to keep the scissors still and rotate your piece as you go around, so you're not trying to cut like this. And my goal when I cut is I always cut right on the outside edge of the line. It may not seem like it's going to make that much of a difference. You could cut inside this line, you could cut right on the line, or you can cut right outside the line. Whatever you do, just pick one and be consistent. I always seem to cut on the outside edge of the line, so I'm going to be very accurate. Accuracy is important because these kind of all fit together like a puzzle. And so now here I have come up to this point right here. And here's where these very sharp tips come in really handy. So instead of trying to use this part of the scissor and cut up and stop, I am going to come back here and I'm going to very carefully snip right up until, using those very sharp tips, right up until that point. Now I can start over with this line. Do the same thing, cut on the outside edge. I'm going to get rid of this so it's not in my way. So here's another point, literally a point, where I'm going to use the tips of the scissors again. I'm going to come in here. So now I've cut all the way up to that point. I can either start here, make sure the other felt is out of the way, and I can go this way. You could also come here if you wanted. It's a little bit more tricky to do this, honestly, but it works. And then again, come right up and snip that off right to the point, and then finish that off. Okay, now I have a little bit of fuzziness right there, so I can just trim that off. All right, so there is my pattern piece, very accurately cut out. You can see it stuck just fine. And now when I go to peel it off, and also as you cut, that the pressure of the scissors going around the edge will also help make it, adhere it to the felt a little bit. But now I can just very carefully peel it off. And even though we reduced that stickiness, okay, it's sticking, do not just rip the paper off. This piece is not that fragile, but some pieces in these ornaments are, like I said, very narrow and very delicate. So pull very slowly and carefully. But you can see it sticks, but it just comes right off. Regardless, be careful when you tear it off. That is important. And sometimes when you peel it off, particularly if you use the method where you have stuck it onto the felt and just use fibers to take away that stickiness, that way it stays much stickier, and so you'll get a lot more fuzziness. You'll have, this side will be fuzzy and there might be fuzziness on the edges. If that happens, and it even happens with this method sometimes, I will very carefully, I'm not trimming the actual felt here. I'm going to make very clear, I'm not trimming the felt. I'm really just sort of running, helps to get the lighting just right. Sometimes if you get a dark background or light it from behind, whatever you can see the best. Sometimes I will just trim those little fuzzies off, but otherwise that gives you a very precise, accurate piece of felt. Once you get all of your pieces cut, I'm going to give you a very important piece of advice, and that is to two things. Leave the sticky patterns, on them until you are ready to tint them, okay? Just leave them on, all right? So you know which piece is which, because sometimes, like particularly on these things that have the ones that have two doves, or these are the two birds, they look very similar. And like for instance, like this piece looks very much like this piece, but if you will keep these on them until you tint them, that will help. While you were tinting them, peel these off, maybe like do just this, tint just the pieces for this bird. When you peel this piece off, keep it. Do not throw this away. Trust me, do not throw this away. Keep these, and you can see I've already lost, I don't have every single piece here, and obviously I've already tinted these, but I kept these around because now when it comes time for me to reassemble, the time comes for me to reassemble them and glue them together, I can tell, oh, this piece, it's labeled the bottom bird, right wing, so I know this is the bird that goes on the bottom, and it's the wing that goes on the right, so I know it goes here. And this wing and this wing look very similar, but they are not identical, so I can, I know that this one is this one, and it goes on this side, and that one is that one, it goes on that side. So just trust me. Keep these pieces so that you can compare later, because obviously when you peel these off and tint them, they're going to be sort of separated, but that will help you later on when it comes time to reassemble the pieces, to keep these, keep them separate, keep them in a bag, and don't throw these away. The next step in making these ornaments is to tint the edges of our felt pieces. And I am not going to lie, I think this is probably, I'm just going to say it, this is probably the most fun part of the whole process. I mean, really, although beading is pretty fun too, but I mean, it's all fun. But let's just face it, adding this fun color, doing this watercolor technique is just, it's like magic, right? And there are a few very specific tools that will make this process work. The most important one is this unassuming little thing right here. And it is a micro tip applicator bottle, and it just has water in it. And it has this very tiny tube right here. And this allows you to really control, you can't really control the water, but you can a little bit. Control the water that you add to your felt pieces. So let me talk a little bit more specifically about how to get the color onto the felt and the two techniques for blending these colors. First, we need to add the color to the felt. So these are just scraps, but you will have already cut out all of your felt pieces, and the instructions will show you exactly which piece and which color to use, and what it looks like before you add the water and afterwards. So you can do it exactly the way I do it, but let me put in here that it is going to be impossible to make yours look exactly like mine. Even if I did 2 in a row and I tried to make them look exactly the same, because of adding the water, it's just sort of an unknown. You might add a little bit more, a little bit less. It's going to go this direction or that direction. The colors are going to blend this way or go that way. It's always going to be a little bit different. And that, of course, is the joy of it and the beauty of it, right? So don't think that if yours looked different than mine that you did it wrong. You didn't. It's just sort of the nature of this technique. But let's get some color onto the edge of these pieces of felt. These are just scraps, all right? But you're working on your cut pieces of felt, your felt patterns. I spent days and hours doing tests. This is just a small portion of the ones that I did. And when I first started out, I was really using these markers and adding a ton of color on the edge. And then when I put the water on, it all just ran everywhere and all the colors ran together, and I just sort of got a third color. And I wanted a little bit more finesse with the color, so I learned not to put, actually to put less color on in general, rather than like coloring whole areas, okay? These markers have two ends. They have a brush tip and they have a fine tip. We're not going to use the fine tip for this technique. We're going to use the brush tip. And so let's just do this right now. Let me just show you. All right, so you can color on here, you can, but I did a lot of, oh, back up. I have to show you my work surface. That's really, really important before we get to the color. Normally when I do these videos, I like to have a nice, clean, white surface, but this is my actual work surface. This is my work table that I always work on, which is white, which is great. But I have put down clear cling wrap, okay? And I started out with just one layer and I worked on it for a while and it got covered in color. And then instead of ripping that up, I just put a second layer down. I did some more color. Then I put a third. This is like 3 or 4 layers. So like, you know, these colors are going to transfer onto this cling wrap. Okay, so it's water-based. It's not gonna, you know, affect you or anything. It will sort of stain your fingers. It comes off easily, but I mean, you'll get it on your fingers. But be careful of whatever work surface you're working on. You don't want to get this ink on, you know, something that's, you know, a special work surface or something. So I can work on my table. I recommend, if you don't have a surface like this, you can get a glass plate or like a glass baking dish or something ceramic or glass, because it's just not gonna, you know, the ink is not gonna soak in. Please don't use anything that you're gonna cook or eat on. If you have like one of those large baking dishes, you could flip it over so you have a nice flat surface. You can also go ahead and take that same baking dish and put the cling wrap over it and then just keep putting layers on, and you still have a nice a surface that the ink's not going to soak through, and still put the cling wrap on it. There's one other thing, and that is you will need sort of one area to apply the ink and then another area to, after you put the water on it, to sort of move it over and let it sit and dry. And so, you know, I have an area here. Let me move these out of the way. So as I worked, I would, you know, I'll color down here perhaps, and all that, you know, that ink will get on here, and then I put the water on it down here, and then I move it up here to the corner and let it, you know, sort of let them all congregate up here. Just make sure it's a spot that won't get disturbed. You're going to want to let these dry, depending on your weather. If it's very hot and dry, you know, some of these pieces will dry in, you know, half an hour, an hour, 2 hours. Some of them with more water will probably need overnight, you know, the ones that really get soaked, okay? So just make sure it's in an area that the wind isn't going to knock it off, or someone's going to knock it off, or the dog or the cat is going to pick it up, or whatever. Just sort of prepare ahead of time, okay? Enough talking, let's get to the fun part. All right, I am going to start out. I'm going to take this lovely magenta color and I am going to add it just to the edge of this blue piece. And I really want it to be really dark in the corners and lighter on the edges. So if you're doing something that's very light, just gently, just barely, like if you're trying to maintain a lot of the felt color in the center, just kind of barely rub that marker on the edge. If you want a lot of ink to be there, just dab it like that. I hold the felt and then I like keep, you know, you can't like really color hard because you'll just mush the felt around. So just dab it on. Sometimes I'll do lighter on there, and then on this corner I'll add a little less, and then just put a little along there. Okay, so that was not a whole lot of ink. There's a lot of ink right here, but don't put so much, like I said, that it just washes over the whole color of felt and just obliterates this blue color. Let's do this one. So now this ink that I just did right there, that is wet. If I touch it, or if I like put this blue on top of it, it will pick up some of the pink. You know, that's not really that big of a deal, but you know, it can change the color. So I'm going to kind of move to a different area here. And now I'm going to take this sort of blue color and do the same thing. So I'm going to put a very light edge on it and then put a little bit more. But aha, here, let me put a little bit right here. Okay, here is where the real fun, this shows up better on light colored felts, is to add 2 colors of marker, and these will blend together. So we know pink and blue together make purple, so where these touch, I'm going to have a purple. I'm going to leave a little bit of an area that's just this magenta. And you really, like I said, you do not have to just add tons of ink for this to really have an effect. So I'm just going to barely put a little dot here and there. Some of those tiny pieces just need barely any ink. You can see how that's just not that much ink. All right, so now let's do, there are 2 methods for adding water with this fine tip applicator. There is the drop method and the flood method. They're pretty self-explanatory, but let me show you. So this allows you, this is a very easy bottle to use, but when I turn it over, I can very gently squeeze it. I don't know if you can see that, and I just get 1 drop out at a time. So when I come to here, I'm just going to, let me zoom in so you can see this. Just a minute. That is really close, so I think you can really see what I'm doing here. So I am going to just do drop, 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 put 1 drop in that corner. Another one kind of came out, that's all right. Just put a little drop and just leave it like that. That's the drop method. Very simple, yes? And as it sits there, the water will move across a little more or stay there, and it will dry a little bit lighter. So, okay, now let's come do the flood method. So if I were to just, let's start out, let me show you the drop method on this light color. For that lovely purple that's going to show up. Okay, so that's the drop method. Really pretty. But let's say I have an area, and more often on these pieces I use the drop method, but there are some ones that I kind of wanted to move the ink a little bit differently or have it wash over it a little bit differently, and so I use the flood method. So this is when you really add a lot of water, and you, like I said, you can direct the direction of the water too. If I want this color to move towards the center of the felt, I would sort of squeeze it out this way. But generally I kind of like to move it more towards the edges if I'm trying to like keep this light colored blue. So let me show you. So if I'm really gonna soak that, I'm really gonna put a lot of water there. So see how those colors really start to really get soft? Let me show you what happens. This is kind of cool. So if I go this direction and I see how the ink kind of pushes out towards the edge, really softens that color. If it's just, if I got too much on there or whatever, but that's a lot of water on there. All right, that's really soaked, and so it's gonna take a good long time to dry, but that gives you a very, very soft effect. Something you do not want to do is to take a paper towel and blot this, because what will happen is 2 things happen. You will push the ink that's on this top, on this side, you'll push it to the back of the felt, and you'll also pick it up on your paper towel. Let me show you on this one. All right, this little one. If I blot this, see all that ink that came up on the paper towel? I don't want it on the paper towel, I want it on my felt. Now, this could be helpful if you just got so much on that it just is not as much as, I mean, you got too much on, but honestly, just put a little less in the beginning and then don't blot it, because this is not where you want the ink to be, the color. You want the color on your felt. One other thing you don't really want to do is use a hair dryer to dry these, and it is very tempting, but there are some of these pieces, for instance, like this one, really tiny. This one's dry, but that's tiny, and if you try to dry that with a hair dryer, it's just going to blow somewhere and you're never going to find it again. So, you know, I really recommend just finding a place and letting it dry. You know, in a pinch, I did take one of the larger pieces, like the background, like, you know, this large piece, and I did use my diffuser on my hair dryer. I know that's zoomed in really far. I did use my diffuser on my hair dryer and put it on there for just a little bit, and you know, I tried it on another piece and it kind of like bent the felt and it dried kind of wonky. So I really don't recommend the hair dryer, but if you need to, stay with it, use the diffuser so you're not just putting a blast of air on it. One last thing I'll say about tools is this is not required. You don't have to do this, but I use this as a tool I use all the time for all different sorts of things. It's just like these big tweezers. They're not sharp, but they're very convenient for when it's super wet to pick it up and move it over to where you're going to let it dry, like over here. You can obviously pick it up with your fingers. You are going to get the ink on your fingers. Just, you just really don't want to transfer a color. Like if I'm using a green color on this piece and a pink color on this piece, I don't want to transfer that green to the pink because then you get brown. I don't want brown, I want green or pink, yes? So sometimes these are a handy little addition to your toolbox. But other than that, that is how to tint these lovely felt pieces. The next step is to glue the pieces together, and the instructions will have there's a very specific reason that I glued certain pieces in a certain order. It just makes sense. There's a reason. It makes sense for how you're going to assemble each section and then assemble the sections together. So pay attention to that. And the glue I'm using is a white tacky glue. And the reason I like the white tacky glue is because it's very thick and sticky, and it allows you to use very small dots of glue that will not soak through to the front. And that's important. If I had used a very thin, like an Elmer's school glue that's very watery, it might very easily soak through to the front of the felt, and I do not want that. Speaking of small dots of glue, there are two ways to get the glue onto your pieces of felt. You could take this glue and squeeze a little bit out onto a little scrap piece of paper and use a toothpick. Use the end of that toothpick, pick up a little bit, and just dab it around the edges. That works great. I like to use guess what? An applicator bottle. This is a different one from the one we're using for the water, but it has a nice fine tip on it. If you'll notice, I'm doing something very important. I keep it stored upside down. I also keep this one stored upside down in a larger jar, okay? But keeping your glue bottle stored upside down allows all of that glue to stay down in the tip, so that if I had stored it up and it gets an air pocket up here, then the tip, any glue that's in the tip, and there will be some, will dry out, and then you've got to you got to clean it out, and the glue doesn't, you have to squeeze really hard and the glue doesn't come out, and then it comes out in a big blob. If you'll store them upside down, all of that glue stays down in the tip and it's always right there and it doesn't dry out. So that's a little tip for you. Put that away so it can stay stored upside down. But really, truly, it is easy. Let me wipe the tip of that. So when you are gluing pieces on, you can maybe see why this is so convenient to just put another consideration is try not to put glue where you're going to be stitching later. Look at the photo. There's not a whole lot of stitching on these, but there are places where you're going to be sewing beads on or doing a little bit of decorative stitching. Don't just smear glue all over the back and plop it down. I generally put little dots of glue on the edge. Or you can run a little line of glue. It does not take much. You do not have to have a humongous bead of glue running all along the edge for these pieces to stick together. I have ornaments that I made years ago that I have done this way, and they are still stuck together. So don't worry about that they're going to fall apart. Plus, remember, you're going to be adding some stitching later and beads, and that will also help hold all the pieces together. So you don't have to squeeze a big mammoth line of glue along all of these edges. When it does come time to glue all of the pieces together, I know I talked previously about keeping these, the pieces that you peel off that are labeled, particularly on these ones that have pieces that look very similar or that have two sort of almost identical but not quite identical things. So I hope you did that. And before you just start gluing them together, like these birds, they have to fit in sort of a very defined area, right? So if I just glue these birds and I think that's how they go. Okay, if I glue this one might not fit on the background piece. So first of all, what I do is I very, kind of like I've done here, I very loosely assemble it, make sure I have all the pieces. I compare it to the picture of the finished bird. So I try to get the angles right, but I'm also going to, and I don't have the background cut out for this one yet, but let's just say this is a color, whatever color this is going to be, and let's just say it has to fit on here. I'm going to, I'm going to take this one and I'm going to sort of, assemble it like this. Obviously, this is kind of, quick. And then I'm going to take this one and I will assemble it and make sure that it's going to fit. Like that. So see, what I'm saying is if I had made these wings like go this out and I glued this one out here and the tail was out here and then I did this one and it was, it just wouldn't fit. So I'm gonna just go ahead and make sure that all the pieces fit and that they generally are at the angles they're supposed to be. Okay, but this is also why I sort of pre-assemble, like the instructions will probably say, assemble this whole wing, assemble this wing, assemble this whole wing, assemble this whole, head section first, so you're not dealing with all these little bitty pieces that are kind of wanting to go everywhere, okay? Anyway, that's just sort of my advice before you glue. Make sure that all your angles are right for everything and that they will fit on the background piece that is meant for it. The stitching and the beading on these they're both really pretty simple. But let me give you just a couple of tips that will make this a little bit easier for you. The branches that are stitched on the background part and, throughout any of these ornaments is, remember when I talked about how it's hard to transfer a pattern onto felt? Well, we're kind of in that situation here. It's hard to transfer that design onto the felt, but these lines are really pretty simple. And you can just eye it, honestly. You can just start stitching. They're so simple. But if you're kind of like me and a little bit picky and you want to make sure you get the line in just the right place, here is my suggestion. I like this pin. It is an air erasable fabric marking pin and it has a very nice sharp tip on it. It's not a big thick line. And this one is pretty old. I've had this for a while, so it's pretty light. But I like it because it is air erasable. It's not water erasable, water soluble, because I can't rinse it out. I don't want to put this whole thing underwater, and I don't want to get any of this tinting wet again because it's water-based. So that's why I'm choosing an air soluble. Do not use a Frixion pen. I like these pens for other things, but I do not use it for this. Why? I could easily heat this up with a hair dryer and get these lines to go away, but as I always caution with these, the ink doesn't really go away. On light colored fabrics, it leaves a yellow line. It just changes colors. The ink is still in the fabric or felt that you put it in. It just changes colors when it gets hot or when you heat it up. So if you put it on a light colored fabric, it turns yellow. If you put it on a dark fabric, it will leave out like a white, we call it like a ghost line. So I don't want to do that. If I mark it on here and then I'm like, oh no, that's in the wrong place and I have to not stitch there, not cover it up with stitching, it might show. So do not use this. That is why I chose to use the air soluble marking pen. And mine is so old, as I mentioned, so it's going to go away very quickly. If you're using a newer one or a brand new one, it's a purple line, that line is going to stay a little bit longer, but it will just go away in the air and it does not leave any kind of residue onto your felt. So here's what I do. So I'm using this. It's hard to, you can't scrape something like a pen, the nib of this, across the felt because it just roughs it up. So what I do is I kind of make I just push down and make like a dotted line. So I'm just looking at the pattern here and I see that this branch, starts about here and it curves around and it goes to about here. So sometimes I'll mark my beginning and ending line. Let me zoom in for you. Okay, now you can see that. All right, so I've kind of given myself an idea and I know it curves. So now I'm just going to make myself a line and I'm just dabbing it so I'm not scraping that felt and roughing it up. So that just gives me the basic line of the stem. I do not want to, I don't need to mark every single leaf because I mean, you can if you want, but I don't generally mark daisy stitch leaves because this thread is not going to sit right on top of the ink. But as I said, this ink will go away, so if you want to mark everyone, that's fine. I'm now doing the split stitch for the stem. Very basic stitch, very easy. The only really thing to remember when you're stitching on this felt, when it's handheld like this, when I pull up and when I pull down, I don't want to pull really hard because I can make that felt pucker up. And particularly if I'm moving from one area, like I'm moving here to a different area, if I pull too hard, that felt will fold up. So you have to have a lighter touch than you would if you were working on, say, fabric in a hoop. So when you pull the thread through, pull it so it's snug, but don't pull it so tight that you distort the felt. For the daisy stitches on here, there are two ways to do daisy stitches, and I have a whole video tutorial that's accessible for everyone if you want to go check that out if you've never done them or if you want to brush up on them, but there's two ways to do them. There's the stab method and there's the sewing method. Normally on stretched fabric in a hoop, I use the stab method, but on felt, it is much easier to get the tension and the length right on daisy stitches when you do the sewing method. So let me show you that. You come up, and here's a good example. I just finished this one, and if I had pulled that too tight, see how I would pull the felt? So just make sure it's loose enough back there. And to do the sewing method, when you come up, you go right back down. I always hold this side of the thread right there so it doesn't get in the way. Put your needle right back down where you came up. Get that in there. And bring the needle up, and that will be the length and the angle of your daisy stitch. But don't pull the needle all the way through. Grab this leg of thread. Get that out of the way. Wrap it around your needle like that. And then sort of hold the thread in place. You can push that needle through some more if you want. Grab the needle, and now when I pull it through, make sure it doesn't catch on the rest of the felt. Now when I pull it through, that daisy stitch is perfect right there. So that's why it's so easy. The thread is already in place. Now I'll put the anchoring stitch down, and that's a daisy stitch. I was going to mention one other thing, that I do the stitching first and the beading second, and that is because all of these stitches and loops, if I do the beading first, it's fun, you want to get to the beading, but if you do all the beading first, it is so many times your thread will catch on a bead and you'll have to stop and unhook it. So just do all of your sort of flat stitching first and do the beading second. It's finally time for us to do some beading, and adding beads is so much fun. It's fun to do, but it's also fun to see the results because they add just the perfect amount of sparkle. You don't need a lot of them, but they are so much fun and look great. So it's very straightforward. I just always use one strand of whatever color makes more sense to me on each one. And so we've got bugle beads and seed beads. And so a little tip on the bugle beads. So I've come up at the point where I want one end to be, and I pick up a bugle bead and I put it on my needle. Now, sometimes both the bugle beads and the seed beads, like this is one, is too small to go over the eye of this needle. So just put that one aside. I keep a little extra bowl that I just put those in. I try another one, and that one worked. I had to squeeze it just a little bit, but it just went right on. And I put it down where I want, at the angle I want that bead to be. So instead of just having it loose like this, pull that other one tight. Instead of just having it loose like this and I just sort of guess about how long the bead is, I put the bead down and I push it up with I hold the thread so I have some tension. As usual, let me zoom in a little bit for you. So I keep some tension on the thread and I pull against it. I pull the thread and push the needle up against the bead so it's pushed up against this end of the stitch. And that way, once it is, tight against the fabric, now I know that is where I'm going to put the needle down, and then I can pick it up. And now the bead is in just exactly the right place. Sewing on the seed beads is just the same as the bugle beads. One strand, come up. I like to keep my, the seed beads, bugle beads you have to pick up, but the seed beads you can just put in a little dish and put the tip of your needle on it and slide it down. Oh, yay, that was one that fit on the needle. You can slide it down if you want and then just go down. Now here, really the only thing to say about the seed beads, and this is super picky, is these are standing up on their sides and they're not perfectly round. They're oblong, they're oval. So depending on if you put your thread through this way, your bead will sit this way. If you put your thread, come up here and go down here, your bead will sit this way. Really, on all of this, it just doesn't matter. But if you want to be super picky about the direction of your bead, sometimes I am, most of the time I'm not. The only other thing, if you're concerned about the only using one strand, then you can absolutely go back through these beads a second time. Sometimes that, particularly the seed beads, it makes the bead more stable because it is on its side, so it can be a little bit wobbly sometimes. So if you come back and make another stitch, like if here's the first stitch or here's the first stitch, and you want to make another one that kind of crosses it, that really helps keep the bead stable. But really, I don't even do that. So because it's just really nice and stable on this felt. And remember, you're also at the end here in one of the next steps, you're going to be putting glue all over the back of this, so that will help secure these threads on the back too. Now let's talk about the craft fuse. And the craft fuse is an iron-on backing that you can iron onto something, to a piece of fabric, to give it some more stiffness or some more body. And not all of my ornament designs use this, but I just felt like these needed a little bit of extra stiffness to them, just to give them so they wouldn't be quite so saggy. And craft fuse has a matte finish side, and then it has a shiny side. This is the side with the adhesive. And this is that situation that I talked about earlier where there's two patterns, combined here. And I've already, I cut around this one, leaving some space. I placed it on the piece of craft bond. I put it on the matte finish side. I have cut it out, and that's what this is. Now I will take this and I will cut out around, I did the cornstarch on the back so it's not so sticky, and it's already been stuck onto one piece of the craft fuse. Now I will cut out around this one. It still has some stickiness to it. Here's my other piece of the craft fuse. This is the shiny side. This is the matte side. And I will put that on there like that. Make sure it's stuck down. And now I will cut this one out. To adhere the craft fuse onto your felt piece, we're going to use an iron. And I do want to mention that, it doesn't, because these pieces are, both the oval and this piece are symmetrical, it doesn't matter. I mentioned, sticking the pattern onto the dull side. It's not going to matter which side you put it on because it's a symmetrical piece. When it comes time to add this onto here, it's not going to matter if we put it onto a, which side. If it's this side or this side, it's just the same. If you're ever doing a pattern that is not symmetrical, you do need to pay attention to the side you put it on, because you'll need to make sure you get the correct side so that when you do put it down onto your piece, it's facing the correct way. But with these being symmetrical, that just doesn't matter. I realized as I was filming that last segment that this piece was cut to the wrong size. It was too big. But I have corrected that now because it's supposed to fit right you know, inside in the center of that piece. So anyway, that is correct now. So now let's get to the part where you iron it on. And always be sure that you are putting the shiny side down. And I'm not actually going to iron it here. This is not a heat safe surface, but I'm just going to demonstrate for you. So you're going to put the shiny side down. Again, doesn't matter which side of this piece it's on because it's all symmetrical. I'm going to make sure that it's in the center. It's not that critical. You just want to make sure it's, you know, going to be covered by the background piece a little bit later. So that's why I designed it to be this size, so it would be fit inside there. Okay, so that's centered. Now you will want to take a press cloth, and this is just any piece of, I use 100% cotton, just a scrap piece of white. I don't, you know, I just don't want to transfer any color or anything. Obviously this one has not been ironed because it's still wrinkly, but anyway, you want it to be a damp press cloth. So I just get a spray bottle, spray this so that it's, you don't want it dripping wet, soaking wet, but I just kind of lightly spray both sides. And then carefully make sure that stays lined up. This one's got a little curve to it, so it doesn't want to pop up a little bit. So then you would take your damp press cloth, very carefully lay it on top so that does not shift. And then you're going to have your iron set to the pattern directions say a wool setting. You can do that. That's just below kind of a cotton setting, but somewhere in there. And then you will take your iron and you will press this on. The package directions say 8 to 10 seconds. And I found for my iron, 8 seconds doesn't seem to be quite long enough, but move it around a little bit because, you know, where these holes are in the bottom of your iron, that's going to be less heat. So just very carefully move it around so that you make sure the whole thing, I usually count 10 seconds, maybe 12 seconds, but, you know, do some tests on your own iron. And then, now be careful, this is going to be hot. Carefully peel away, again, this is not hot. I did not have my iron on, but carefully peel away your press cloth, and this is going to be very soft. And it might have just a little bit of, not really stickiness to it. So, but I mean, this is not going to be stuck, but carefully peel that off and let this cool, because if you go ahead and pick it up, I mean, it should be stuck, but it's going to feel very soft, like it's not doing its job. But if you will let it cool, once it cools off, this will now have some stiffness to it. But I let it cool and I check to make sure, like I go around and I, you know, just check the edges and I make sure I don't have like a big, like one time I ironed one and like this section ironed on really well and this section was loose and I could just peel it back. So I just re-ironed that section, but let it cool, make sure that the whole thing is adequately adhered. One of the last things you'll need to do to make these ornaments is to create the hanger. And we're going to use the same thread that we used for stitching on the ornaments. And we're going to braid 3 pieces together. So the instructions will tell you how long to make it. And here's 3 pieces. And I have tied the ends together on one end. And then on the other end, I've made sure that I've snipped those. Okay, so those are all cut. And now we are going to braid these together. And braiding is not very hard. You may or may not have ever done it before, but it could be that if you've done it, it was with hair perhaps. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips about how to create a nice flat smooth braid with these threads. First, if you have never done any braiding, let me show you how to braid. It is very simple. You've got 3, I'm using this bright pink yarn. You've got 3 pieces and you're just always going to bring the outside to the middle. Now this one is on the outside and bring it to the middle. Now this one is the outside and bring it to the middle. Outside, middle, outside, middle, and just repeat that over and over. Now, as you're watching me do this, you are seeing that it is difficult to braid something evenly and tightly when this end is not attached to anything. I mean, I'm getting a braid, but it is very, very loose. And, you know, for some things, if that's the look you want, that's fine. But we want a nice tight braid. And it is difficult to be able to pull these securely each time without it flipping over like that. And you want to maintain, you want this, you want the same side to always be up. You don't want to be twisting it or pulling on these and then having them, you know, twist up like that. You just don't want that. So here is what we are going to do. Here's what I do to prevent that from happening. I have, now it's off camera here because I had to put it, I didn't want to tape onto this thing, but when I am braiding these, I take my 3 pieces of the embroidery thread, tie a knot in one end, and then I tape the knotted end, just the knot, right over the knot, onto the edge of a table. And it's a table that makes sure it's one that the tape is not going to ruin. This is masking tape I'm using. Masking tape, you know, is this, you know, kind of like whatever color this is. And it's very sticky, so it's really going to hold that tape. You can also have a friend or a partner to hold the knot while you are braiding, giving you even tension. But you don't want them to be pulling on it or, you know, pulling away or loosening up. You want it to be, you know, sort of secure. So that's why sometimes taping it is easier, because it doesn't go anywhere. But so now let me keep working on this one. I've got it started. Let me get a little further so you can see. I zoomed in for you so you can see what I'm doing. And here is the braid that I have going. And so when I braid like this, because it's taped, I can pull on it, you know, pretty hard, and I can keep tension in the braid as I pull it towards me as I braid. And this one, I don't want to let up on that tension, so I do it this way. Can you see what I'm doing? I reach under and I grab with these fingers and I bring the right side over, and then I reach under with these fingers and bring the left side over, and I just keep a constant tension while I'm doing that. One thing to note about this is that every once in a while I stop where I'm braiding and I pinch it to hold it, and see how all of these threads get all twisted up. You have to, every 4 or 5 times that you go to the center, I stop and I untwist these. If you go 6 inches and keep doing that, all of these threads down here are going to be all twisted together and you're going to have a knot. So stop regularly and untwist them. But now I can start back up. I just did the right side. Now I'll go left. So even though it's kind of turning a little bit each time, I'm being very careful to make sure that this stays flat, that it doesn't flip over or twist up on itself. Just like that. So that's why that tension at the top is really important, to keep it from twisting and, you know, bunching up on itself. The closer you get to the end, you'll need to go a little slower and be careful that you don't accidentally let go of those threads. But when you do get to the end, you know, you can leave about that much, and then I'm pinching it right where the braid ends, but I'm going to be carefully come up here and put these through and just tie a knot, hoping that I don't let go of the part where the braid is, and just tie a knot in the end to hold the braid right there. And that's all there is to it.